Live.
Olá, boa tarde a todos, a todas e a todes. Sejam muito bem-vindas e bem-vindos a essa nossa atividade desta tarde. É um prazer imenso receber vocês no nosso ciclo de 10 anos do PPGRI em mais uma atividade. Estamos tentando realizar ao longo desse período pandêmico que também se combinou com a comemoração dos 10 anos de criação e de trabalho do nosso programa de pós-graduação, né? Hoje nós temos um tema muito interessante, trazido pelo professor Olivier Costa, que é um convidado da professora Clarissa, que coordenará os trabalhos. De pronto, a coordenação agradece à professora Clarissa essa intermediação e o convite, também ao professor Olivier pela sua presença. É uma oportunidade única, conversávamos isso um pouquinho nos bastidores, se há alguma coisa boa que a pandemia nos trouxe, essa possibilidade de termos acesso às pessoas que estão distantes de nós e que, de alguma forma presencial, teríamos dificuldade para trazê-las, né? Então, eu espero que vocês aproveitem muito a fala de hoje, que versará sobre a política externa da União Europeia. Eu acho que é um tema que a gente trabalha muito pouco no Brasil, que a gente precisa se aprofundar mais, a gente precisa ter uma interlocução maior para entender as bases, as características das políticas públicas praticadas nessa área na Europa como um todo, em especial na União Europeia, e dali tirar possibilidades de ação, exemplos e até pensamentos críticos que possam se encaixar depois na nossa realidade e construir a nossa percepção sobre a política internacional, que é o nosso objetivo na área das relações internacionais. Então, sem mais delongas, eu agradeço a todos vocês, explico novamente como se dá o nosso ciclo. A fala do professor irá acontecer durante 40, 50 minutos, e vocês podem fazer perguntas pelo chat ali do YouTube, que serão repassadas ao final da palestra numa sessão de perguntas e respostas, né? Hoje a nossa palestra ocorrerá em inglês, a professora Clarissa falará um pouquinho mais sobre isso, mas então se livre para também fazer perguntas tanto em português ou em inglês. Então, novamente, é um prazer. Peço que, para nos ajudar, curtam a nossa página, curtam esse evento, marquem o sininho, que dessa maneira a gente terá um pouco mais de visibilidade no algoritmo do YouTube, levando temas tão importantes como o debatido de hoje para uma colocação mais acima, for aparecer na procura do YouTube sobre palavras-chave que dizem respeito à política externa, à União Europeia, à própria UFSC e ao próprio programa de pós-graduação em Relações Internacionais. Então, muito obrigada, espero que tenham uma excelente tarde. Professora Clarissa, muito obrigada pelo seu convite. Professor Olivier, thank you so much for being here with us, and good luck in that afternoon. Professor Clarissa?
Yes, sure. Muito obrigada, Dani. Muito obrigada. Então, boa tarde a todas, todos e todes. Good afternoon. Welcome to this open class on European Union's foreign policy. We're more than happy to welcome Olivier Costa from Sciences Po and Colégio da Europa to share with us his last thoughts on the evolution of European Union's foreign policy, European Union role in the world, and especially European Union's relations with Latin America. Olivier is also presenting us his last book with the same title, União Europeia e Sua Política Exterior, published in Portuguese last year, which is open access. We'll share the webpage here soon, so you can access it. Olivier Costa holds a PhD in political science from the University of Paris 8. Currently, he's research professor at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique within the CEVIPOF Research Center of Sciences Po Paris. He's also director of studies at the European Political and Governance Studies Department of the Collège of Europe, Bruges. He's executive editor of the Journal of European Integration and member of the editorial board of the Journal of Legislative Studies and Italian Political Science Review. He has been studying European Union's institutions, especially the European Parliament, for some years now. So we're honored to have him today to debate these issues with us. This conference celebrates, as Daniele said, 10 years of our master's degree in international relations here at UFSC, and is receiving especially students from the course Brazilian Foreign Policy, which is taking place this semester. You can share comments and questions with us in the chat, and in Portuguese, in English, or in French, or other languages, and we will, after the conference, we will pass the questions to Olivier Costa. So, vocês podem colocar questões no chat em português, francês ou inglês, e a gente vai traduzindo depois, ao final da palestra, as questões para o professor Olivier. Olivier, c'est un vrai plaisir de te recevoir encore une fois ici à notre université, à UFSC. Merci beaucoup. Et donc, la parole est à toi. Merci.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, dear Clarissa, dear Daniele. Always a pleasure to speak to a Brazilian audience, even if it's better when I can come nearby. But this year it will be by video conference. Next time I will come, because here it starts to be winter time, so maybe it's the right moment to come to Brazil. So today, as Clarissa told you, I will discuss about the external relation of the EU and maybe try to answer to the more specific question, that is, what kind of power can the European Union be? So I don't want to lecture you and explain you how complex the EU is when it comes to external relation, all the institutions, all the procedure. This is pretty boring. You will find that all in the small book Clarissa told you about. This is a book that was written for the delegation of the European Commission in Brazil. And so it is intended for students like you and civil servant and diplomat who want to know a bit more about the European Union, globally speaking, and more specifically, how the EU is organizing its external relation. What I would like to do now is discuss more about really the current state of what the EU tries to do as a power. And this is a very recent story, because maybe 3 or 4 years ago, no one was raising that kind of question. And this is very much linked to the appointment of Ursula von der Leyen at the head of the European Commission in 2019. We had European election in 2019 in June, and just after that, we had Ursula von der Leyen, who's a German politician, as the head of the Commission. And then she came in front of the European Parliament, because the European Parliament needs to vote to approve her choice. And she presented herself and presented a program, and she said that her commission would be geopolitical. That was the concept, the key concept of her speech, saying my commission will be geopolitical. This was a major change because traditionally the Commission is quite neutral as an organ, mainly an administrative body. So we already had some turn with the previous commission that was appointed in 2014 with Jean-Claude Juncker as a president, and he called his commission as political. He wanted to make the commission a more political body. And then Ursula von der Leyen came with that idea of a geopolitical body, which is, in short, the idea that the Commission should be a body thinking about the world at a global level and not only at a European scale. So why do we have that? It's quite obvious. It's because the contemporary world is increasingly hostile, I would say, because all the major threats, if you think about climate change, pandemics, terrorism, resource depletion, all those threats are global and can only be fixed at global level. Also, there was a new context in 2019 with the isolationism of United States, of Donald Trump, the new ambition of China, some sort of hostility from Russia. And there was a bit that idea that European Union at global level no longer had a natural ally, because things were turning a bit wrong, and all the big blocs were a bit in a position of hostility. So then, once you said that the Commission would be geopolitical, what do you say? It's not very clear. And people have been wondering now in the 2 last years about what it can be. It can be several things. It can be first rethinking all European policies in the light of the international context, saying that when you think about competition policy, agricultural policy, trade policy, you need to take the global challenge into account. It can be something else. It can be the fact that you abandon the idea or the objective of a peaceful vision of international relation that would be based on ideals of peace, democracy, mutual aid. This has been very central in the history of European integration, and maybe it's the end of the naive Europe, as some said. Maybe it is more. Maybe it is a will to assert the EU as a power capable to confront with other blocs, Russia, China, India, maybe Brazil. And yeah, and maybe it was even worse. That would be the fact to rely the real politics, the realpolitik, and having a more maybe selfish approach of the role of the European Union. So 2 years after that declaration about the EU becoming, or that should become geopolitical, we still don't exactly know what kind of foreign policy the Commission is trying to do, but at least there is a clear consensus on the idea that the European Union must exist on the global scale, other than just a commercial player or a proselytizers of its own values, and that some brainstorming or further brainstorming is needed to define the role of the European Union at global level. So let's first say a word about the changing international context, and here I'm speaking to students in international relations, so nothing new for you. What we can say is that globally the international context has been transformed quite a lot in the last years, forcing in fact the European Union to rethink its role and its global strategy regarding foreign affairs. And this has been very difficult for the EU because historically European integration always aimed at promoting a conception of international relations that would be guided by trade liberalization, the promotion of multilateralism, the defense of democracy and human rights, and the affirmation of the Union as a model for peaceful regional development, and the idea that other zones in the world, like the Mercosur, could follow a bit that kind of model of peaceful integration based on trade and the promotion of democratic values and so on. But that model has been very much shaken by several phenomena. The emergence of new powers, that was quite unexpected. The rate at which China became a big bloc. The evolution of Brazil, and especially the political change in Brazil, the evolution in India, the return of Russia that no one expected after the 90s. Also, there is a problem of the decline of the EU that is faster than expected. If you look at the population of the EU, if you look at the GDP of the EU, there are really worrying prospect of relegation now in Europe. People have the feeling that within 20 years, 4 years, European Union will just be a place for vacation for powerful Chinese or Brazilian tourists. And so there is the idea that some strategy is needed to fix that situation. There is also the situation of protectionist reflex that was fueled by people like Donald Trump, which is creating a crisis around that idea of a multilateral world that would be governed by multilateral institutions. Remember, the first decision that were taken by Donald Trump was to remove the USF or a number of international organizations, really putting that model of development in crisis. And there is something even more fundamental. It's the idea that the European Union project is facing a crisis of Western values, if I can call that like that. Fundamental rights are in crisis in many countries, including within the European Union. If you think about the political situation in countries like Hungary or like in Poland. The democratization movement, everybody thought that democratization was going on and developing in the 90s, 2000, etc. It is no longer true. The figures are not good. There is a growing number of countries which are moving far from a democracy. And the prediction of Francis Fukuyama about the end of history and the fact that liberal, democratic, and liberal also from an economic standpoint model would prevail and that all countries would go in that direction, this prediction was wrong. Look that the Arab Spring did not work, situation in Russia is not good, China is not democratizing, and other countries are moving from democracy. And finally, we had that problem with the emergence of what is called civilization states, states who obviously claim that they don't want to follow Fukuyama's prediction. Countries like China, like India, like Russia, like Turkey, they reject the Western nation state model. They claim the specificity of their own way of life, their own values, their own conception of political and social organization, as well as international relation. And they claim that the EU is not qualified to consider that its values are aimed to become universal. So this very difficult context is creating a new discourse on the sovereignty of European Union or on the role of European Union. And this is really new. 3 years ago, it was very difficult to find any declaration by a European leader talking about the sovereignty of the EU or talking about the EU as a power or talking about notion like strategic autonomy, which is a brand new concept in the European sphere. And this has a reason. The reason is that European integration was made since the 1950s in the explicit refusal of any claim to sovereignty. There was a refusal to consider that the EU could become a sovereign body because the member states don't want to abandon the sovereignty. So this was very clear as soon as the end of the 1940s that some governments in Europe were ready for European integration, but they will not abandon their regal powers and not abandon their autonomy regarding foreign affairs and defense and security to a bloc. And this continues through the history of European integration with always that intergovernmental trend within EU institution, rejecting that idea of the EU becoming political. And that's why European integration has been developed as mainly with an economic vocation, carried out with legal instruments, and with a tendency to erase the political dimension of everything. So very technical negotiation, very depolitized discussion on everything, and a difficulty for the EU to address the real big political issues. This was the business for the member states. So there has been an evolution to where we are today. First of all, there's been some sort of politicization of the European Union. A major date for that, for instance, is 1979, with the first direct election of the European Parliament. De facto, you have politicization when you have an elected parliament in the European Union. It is not a federal parliament, but still there's been an evolution here. And so with a possibility, especially within the European Parliament, to address big issues and to have a discussion around political issues. So the second change we had is the progressive emergence of the notion of power applied to European integration. And this started as soon as the 70s, not in EU institutions, not among the national leaders, but in the academic sphere. Someone like the political scientist Johan Galtung, he qualifies the community the European community as a superpower in the making as soon as the 1970s. He had the feeling that it was not possible for the European community to remain just an economic actor, and that there was something developing regarding power. And so we had several concepts emerging in international relations applied to the EU. The notion, for instance, of civil power, European integration as a civil power. That means a power that has a global role as an economic and commercial power, but which is also very active in the field of development aid and cooperation. It has no military capability as such, no claim to coercion, but European integration was active as a civil power at global level. A bit later, we had another notion that was the notion of the European communities as normative power. Here, the idea was that European integration was trying to diffuse, to disseminate a certain number of values or conception of relations between states and a certain vision of the international order, and was acting as a normative power, a power that was diffusing norms. What is good governance? What is a peaceful international environment? And so regional organizations like Mercosur were fueled with European money, with the idea that it was part of the mission of European communities to diffuse those norms of regional integrations through business and trade and very peaceful relation. And so European communities imposed themselves as a new kind of entity, a new kind of power at global level, something very different from the classic concept of international relation, nothing linked with conflict, with force, with coercion, but still something. A third major step was the Treaty of Maastricht in 1993 that turned the European communities that were mainly economic in the European Union, that had a bigger ambition and that wanted to become a political body. So here it was really about considering the European Union as a polity, as a politically organized human entity of 15 and then later 20 and 125 and 27 countries, equipped with a common foreign and security policy. So we have that common and foreign security policy since 1993. It is not easy to develop it because the member states have kept their own defense policy and security policy and diplomacy, autonomy, etc., etc. So it has developed, but it's difficult because there is a lack of political will to make something out of that common foreign and security policy. Some states are very jealous of their own power status. Some others are very attached to their neutrality. If you consider countries like Austria, Finland, Sweden, they're neutral countries. They don't want to be involved in a war someplace. Also, there were conflict between the member states regarding the relation to NATO, because part of the member states really consider that all the issues linked to defense, security, etc., are to be fixed by NATO with the USA and not by European Union on its own. But still, this developed a bit with a common defense policy and so on. And so more recently, we had the emergence of a new discourse on the sovereignty of the European Union, and with that new context that created some sort of pressure and a sense of urgency in Europe that something needed to be made. Clearly, with some pressure coming from Russia. Now people are talking about maybe Russia invading Ukraine. This is really a possibility, or Russia invading the Baltic states, who are part of the European Union. There was also the problems with Donald Trump saying more or less that if something happened in Europe, maybe he wouldn't feel that much concerned and he wouldn't like to spend US money to defend the Baltic state because he does not even know where it is on a map. And public opinion are changing rapidly in Europe about that because they have a tendency now to accept the idea that the European nation states are not big enough to ensure the security, and that something needs to be done at European level. And now in the recent times, the 2 or 3 last years, we have now European leaders, including national European leaders, calling the Union to find its place in the concept of superpower. For instance, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has been discussing that issue quite often. Okay, but then what kind of sovereignty for the European Union? It's easy to say that the EU should become a power, but what kind of power? First, we have a problem with that notion of geopolitical Europe because it is fundamentally in contradiction with the history and values of European integration. To be a geopolitical power means that you try to control a territory. And the EU was built against the idea of controlling a territory. It's a fundamentally pacifist and humanist project. It is something based on the belief of the possibility of cooperative relation between the states. It is based on the refusal of any imperialist aim. It is based very much on the attachment to multilateralism, but this does not fit very well with the idea of a geopolitical body. So to move further, we need a certain number of clarification, and those clarification are not easy to obtain in a fragmented polity like the European Union, composed of 27 sovereign states who don't share the same views. What are those questions that needs to be clarified? For instance, what is the place of the European Union between the United States, China, and Russia? Are we friends with one of those blocs, or are we just opponent to all of them? And it's difficult in the current world to be friends with anyone because there are very different models of political, economic, and social development and very different vision of international relation. If you see the visions of India, China, Russia, or even Brazil. There is also a stronger competition for scarce resources. It's very difficult today to find resources, to find energy, etc., and there are tensions between the blocs because of that. Globally, those blocs and the world is less inclined to international solidarity than in the past. Look at what happened with the COVID crisis. It was everyone just struggling to find vaccine for its own people. And at European level, they wanted to do something nice, so they organized the production of vaccine at the level of the 27, not between the member states, to avoid member states to compete for the vaccines. They wanted to avoid a situation of the representative of Italy, France, and Croatia, and other countries queuing in the offices of Pfizer to buy vaccines. So the European Commission has organized buying vaccine for everyone, and also organized buying and producing vaccines to send them to Africa and some areas in the world where it's very difficult to access vaccine, and 25% of the production of European vaccines have been exported. Yeah, and another problem is that historically the EU has been very connected to the USA, especially in some countries. Some countries are very Atlantist. If you consider the Netherlands, if you consider Poland, even Germany has been very Atlantist. But now it's difficult to align our objective with the United States because we don't have the same objectives anymore. The USA are still searching for world domination. And European Union is looking for something else. European Union is looking for a world in which the other partners are just respecting the rules of the economic, the commercial, and the political game. There is no will to dominate the world. Another major issue of defining that role at international level is that to do that, you need to admit that the European project has failed. European Union has not been able to shape the world according to its own views. I mean, ideas like multilateralism, peaceful cooperation, and has not been able to shape the world according to its own values, like democracy, human rights, progressivism, sustainable development, cohesion, whatever. So we need to move back to a more traditional approach of international relations to escape decline. So this implies a change of scale in the design of European policies, but also a more political and a more strategic approach of major issue, maybe a less bureaucratic and less expert approach of those issues, and a more conflictual one. We have in France our Minister of European Affairs, his name Clément Beaune, he was a student of mine at the College of Europe, and he said basically that European Union cannot remain the only herbivore in a world full of carnivore. So we cannot be the only animal eating grass in a world which is made of flesh eaters. So the idea is a bit that is for European Union to stop believing only in peaceful coexistence at international level and to define a strategy. This implies for the Commission to embrace the idea of power and sovereignty. But this is not easy for two main reasons. The first reason is that power and sovereignty since the 1950s has been seen in Brussels as obstacles to European integration, because the objective of European integration was about removing trade barriers and organizing multilateralism. So in a way, the nation states were seen not as the enemies, but everyone was expecting the nation states to lose their competence at European level. So now to move back to a position in which you try to make a state out of the European Union is something very difficult to accept for many people in Brussels. And so the second difficulty we have is to define that notion of sovereignty. And today there is no. When people are talking about power and sovereignty for the EU, it is not to describe a reality, it's just to plan for the future. It's a prescriptive concept. It is not a descriptive concept, because currently we don't have that sovereignty and we don't have that power. So what has been done so far in the last months or in the last years? The first thing to say here is that since the early 2000s, the Commission has not been in a position of developing any sort of strategy, because the Commission has just been struggling with emergencies. The financial crisis that started in 2008. Then we had the refugee crisis, millions of people who went to Europe because of what was happening in the Middle East. Then we had very difficult tension with Russia because of the situation in Georgia. Then we had the Brexit that was voted in 2016. Then we had some tension with countries like Hungary and Poland that were not really respecting anymore the democratic values and the human rights. And now there is a COVID situation, the pandemic and the economic crisis. So it's very difficult for the Commission to organize itself, because it is just like a firefighter just fighting one fire after another. And the big program of the Geopolitical Commission that was launched in 2019 by the Commission was a bit disrupted by the COVID situation. So a certain number of things have been done, especially for European policies like competition, energy, agriculture, research, industry, and also regarding everything that relates to the budget. And here the idea is to adapt a bit those policies to that new global challenge. For instance, there is now real reflection about an industrial policy, saying, for instance, is it possible for the EU to rely fully on China when it comes to produce vaccines or medical equipments or drugs, because we have lost all our facilities to do that. And so you discover that there is a global crisis, that you need to import those stuff from China, but they want to keep them keep it for their own people. And so you discover that you are very weak. And so notion as strategic autonomy are also linked with that. This also applies to IT technologies and computers, etc., because basically we built nothing in Europe regarding that. I think the situation is the same in Latin America. We are totally dependent on China and the goodwill of China to export those goods. The EU has also worked quite a lot regarding trade policy because there was some very hostile attitudes from the USA, from China, from Russia, and now maybe the EU is a bit less naive and nice in those discussions. A lot has been done also to bring the giants of the digital economy into line, to tax the GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. There is a very important plan in France to create taxes for those, and now the reflection is even at global level, as you know, and a lot of fines were also put on those companies because they don't respect the basic principle of competition policy. And now there is also a reflection about developing new international links with Africa, with maybe Latin America, not to rely only on relation with the USA, China, and Russia, blocs that are not as friendly as expected. A lot has been done also on the question of values, with a new approach of European values, not as something just to promote saying everybody should love democracy and human rights and the peaceful approach of international level, but it is about protecting now European values against the rest of the world. So here's quite a pessimistic view, the idea that, okay, we are not going to convince everyone to stick to our values, but at least we should be able to continue in Europe to live with our values. And it's not that easy because countries like Russia, like China, and even the USA, if you take the neoconservatives, they're doing a lot to try to undermine those values in Europe, getting involved in the Brexit vote, in European election, in national election, in the media. You have media in France, like Russia Today is a media in France, which is constantly, every day, describing France as a place for chaos. It's a nightmare, it's anarchy, it's a dictator. And this is funded directly by the Kremlin, with the idea that not only they don't like our values, but they would like very much the European Union to stop focusing on those because it's a bit annoying. Yeah, and so there is also a reflection about some sort of, I would say, identity policy. No one is talking about that, but it's about trying to explain that we European 450 million people, we share a belief in those values and in that way of life. And it's a way to define what Europeanness is. It's very difficult to define what Europeanness is because the EU is a very fragmented bloc. There is not that much in common if you compare the life or the culture or the beliefs of a Portuguese, a Finnish, a Lithuanian, a Croatian, and a Greek citizen, and a Polish citizen. They have very different approaches of life, values, religion, politics, whatever. But it is easier maybe to define what is common between the European countries if you look at global level. We maybe don't know exactly why we are doing things together, but we know that our values are very different from the one of the Russians, from the one of the Chinese, from the one of the Africans, from the one of the USA of Donald Trump. And it is a way also to build a bloc around a certain number of common ideas. And the last idea with values, I would say, is the idea now, which is pretty clear in Brussels, that the EU will not be able to impose its value at a global scale, but that maybe it's not such an issue, that other blocs can live with other values, as long as we are allowed to continue to live with our own values and to promote those values in international relation. But then talking about identity is not an easy task. You cannot speak in Europe about European civilization because Europe has been the major player of colonization all around the world. Whenever you speak about European civilization, it reminds very bad memories in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, etc. And that's why European Union has always been very cautious about talking about its own identity, because European Union does not want to be accused of neocolonialism when developing international relations. So very politely, for instance, in the Commission, they've created a portfolio around the European values, but they didn't call it something like promotion of European values or promotion of European identity. No, it was defined the other way around. Defending the European way of life. That was the title of the commissioner in charge of defending the European way of life. And we see here that it was a very defensive approach of things, like if other blocs worldwide were trying to fight our values or something. To conclude, maybe, the next big step for the European Union will be about defining more clearly its ambitions as a power. And this is not an easy task, because if you just organize a meeting of the European Council with the head of state and head of government of the 27, you make them sit around the big table and you say, okay, let's define now the strategy of the EU at global scale. It will be super difficult, because the member states have very different approaches of international relation and are still very attached to the sovereignty in the field of foreign affairs, in the field of defense, and so on. And we have a variety of countries, at least in 3 dimensions. First of all, there are countries that are more or less willing the EU to become a superpower. Some are still very much willing the EU just to remain a place for business. This is one of the reasons why the Brits have left the EU. They were a bit fed up with all the ambitions to develop other policies. They were attached to trade. They wanted the single market, that's all. Other countries are maybe willing to make the EU a place for financial solidarity, maybe a federation one day, maybe a superpower, maybe a place for more policies of education and research, whatever. And so the perception of the 27 member states are quite diverging on that view. Second, if you consider strictly international relation, we still have countries that are very active in international relation, that have a long tradition of being active at international level, like France. Some who don't have such a tradition, because they are too small. I mean, if you take Croatia, Latvia, Luxembourg, the Republic of Ireland, you never heard about their action at international level because they're not active at international level, I mean, in conflicts and so on. And then we have a third category of countries, those who are neutral, and they don't want to be involved, and they don't want the EU to be involved, because they have a tradition which is not only about not getting involved, but about remaining really neutral, not taking any sort of position there. So second difficulty regarding perception of international relation. And a third one is the fact that if you look at what kind of relation and perception the 27 member states have of their link with USA, with Russia, or with China, it's very fragmented. We still have countries that are very Atlantist. I guess that even now the Polish leaders understand that more or less American citizens are not ready to get killed for them. But when it comes about buying planes or buying weapons or whatever, they will always turn to the USA because this is a tradition. The same with Russia. In some countries of the EU are obsessively against Russia. If you go on the eastern part of the bloc, if you discuss with people in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Romania, they hate Russians. They're obsessed with Russians. Some of my colleagues, reasonable people, professor of political science in Poland, in Hungary, etc., they would refuse to shake the hand of any Russian citizens. Very educated people, because it's an obsession. On the contrary, in some other member states, the relation with Russia are very good. There are some quite pro-Russian countries. Greece is one. France is another one, with people at the extreme left of the spectrum and the extreme right of the spectrum totally connected with the Kremlin. So this is also creating tension. The same with China. Some countries just consider that China is a very good partner for business, like Germany. and others consider that the Chinese are not respecting copyrights, human rights, etc., and that we cannot do that much business with them because they're not respecting our values. So here it's also a difficulty. So in the very recent period of time, we had some efforts to think about the future, the strategic future of the EU. I would mention two. The first one comes from Josep Borrell. Josep Borrell is the vice president of the Commission in charge of external relations, and he's also what we call the high representative of the European Union for foreign affairs. And he has released a document which is named the Strategic Compass, which is a document which is developing a theory of the role and the place of the EU at global level in classic international relation. What should we do in case of conflict, how we should defend ourselves, etc. And it's a very important document because it's one of the first real attempts of the EU to define such a strategy. Another one is French President Emmanuel Macron. We have a system of rotating presidency of what is called the Council in the European Union. Every country is having that presidency for 6 months, and the French presidency will start in January 2022. And Emmanuel Macron wants to do something big about that, that concept of strategic autonomy of the EU. What should the EU do to have some autonomy regarding medical device, regarding energy, regarding computer, regarding IT, and what kind of foreign policy can we put on top of that? So he will certainly not fix the problem alone, but at least he's able to launch a reflection at the highest level on those challenges. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for this very, very interesting and panoramic and provocative view on European Union's foreign policy. So I remind students that they can write questions in Portuguese, English or French. Vocês podem escrever as perguntinhas no chat em português, inglês ou francês. Fiquem bem à vontade. So for now, I will enjoy the time and I will ask Olivier some questions if he still has some minutes with us. Olivier, I feel very, very, very stimulated by your thoughts and your views. And I have 2 or 3 questions. I will start with this reflection on maybe on the. I would like to know actually. You're talking about this strategy, this new strategy that is needed by the European Union to act in the world and to act in foreign policy. And maybe Macron is going to deal with these questions next year. My point of view is from Latin America, of course, and here in some political movements and in some political parties and in academia, in universities, we're talking a lot about this decolonial turn. It means that we, this political movement or parties defend that we should surpass or go beyond some values and some practices that are linked to our colonial period, such as slavery, such as extractivism, such as inequality and domination, for instance. And I would like to ask you, is the European Commission thinking about including this kind of problem in this new strategy, or is this topic addressed in the European Union in discussions in the Commission or in the European Parliament? Because in Latin America and especially in Brazil, this decolonial turn for the left means South-South relations. So the European Union is not the priority, because the priority would be South-South relations. And for the right, it means a ultranationalism, as we are having now in this current presidency in Brazil. So how would the European Union respond to that or present itself to this debate? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very good question. I would say that that story of the decolonialism is just at the very origin of European integration, because European integration started to emerge in the 1960s when the member states or the colonial member states were experiencing a process of decolonization. Think about, I don't know, the situation of France, for instance, that has gone through that decolonial process all through the 1960s. And I would say deeply rooted in the Commission, there is that idea that the EU should not be colonial and should design its international action not to be accused to be colonial. So one of the very first move at international level that was done by the EU in the early 70s was the Lomé Convention. That was an agreement signed with the 56 poorest country on earth that were basically all former colonies of European states, offering them free access to the European market, but not in the other way, and some programs for aid and cooperation, etc., with really that idea of a debt the EU owed to those countries. And I would say that it continues pretty much today, and it is an obstacle in the definition of a more, let's say, aggressive geopolitical approach for the European Union, because it's in total contradiction with that idea of the EU, who does not want to do what the USA or what Russia have been doing in having some sort of new colonial approach of international relation, securing that country as a place for resource, putting a dictator here and challenging that government there, depending on their interest to access to oil or, I don't know, banana or cocoa or whatever. So this is something very important, and I would say that this has not changed. And you can feel that still today, for instance, in negotiation like on climate change, if you take the COP26, because not only is the EU always supposed to show the example to do more than the other countries, even if it's not that easy, but also the EU is always advocating very much for having some transfers of funds from the north to the south, to say basically we were the polluters as soon as the 19th century, and so we have a debt to the southern countries who only started to pollute 20 years ago, and so they need money to transform their economy, because we cannot ask them just not to do what we have been doing for 200 years. So this is there. Then regarding the most recent trend in academia or in political life around that idea of decolonization, yes, this is something we start to feel quite a lot in Europe. I would say among my students, it's massive. But you can also feel that very much in the European Parliament among the left-wing political parties, saying that the EU should not become a neo-colonial power. So defining a new approach of geopolitics, this is very nice. But if the objective is for the EU just to go in Africa and fight with China and the USA to buy resources over there using the same methods as the other, this cannot go. So here it's just a matter also of political division and taboo. And as you know, European Union is very fragmented also from a political standpoint, with also people who consider that we should stop being naive, and if the USA do it, we can do it as well, and others are claiming just for closing the borders, which is basically the view of the extreme right, who are just considering that autonomy and isolation is a possible strategy. So I think it's a topic which will become massive in the years to come, especially when trying to define what can be the role of the EU at global level.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, it's very difficult also because when we look to these other powers you mentioned, China, Russia, and the US, for instance, in their practices, they have domination in the practice. They have colonial values in their practices. So I question myself if southern countries or if Latin America is looking at these powers with the same problematic, with the same decolonial questions, because it's not coming only from the EU, it's coming from the other powers as well, and how we will deal with China, how we will treat these other relations, actually. So I think for us also, it's an open debate, and we should deal with it very seriously in the next years. We have some questions here. I'll read you the questions, Olivier, and then I have some more questions as well. Andri, it's our student here. He's from Italy, but he's now our student here at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. And he's asking, as the EU is a very fragmented bloc, it is technically possible to make a significant change in foreign policy and reach a consensus towards a specific policy within only 6 months of presidency?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I would say there are two answers to that. First of all, if you consider European integration as it is since the 1950s, basically, theoretically speaking, it's impossible to have an agreement on anything. You just take even 6 countries, put them around the table, ask everyone what he wants and what his position is regarding that and that project, and it's quite likely that you will have 6 different positions. So European integration has been always about the capacity to create a consensus out of fragmentation, even on very difficult topics and even when it's about unanimity. Each time we had a new treaty, the decision to the negotiation of the treaty was made at unanimity. And we had numerous treaties. We had the Treaty of Maastricht, we had Amsterdam, we had Nice, we had the Treaty of Lisbon. So we have one treaty every basically 5 years. Even when it is unexpected that an agreement would be possible, it is possible. It is possible because you have some routines of negotiation, because when you negotiate at European level, it's not like if you negotiate in a diplomatic conference. You are negotiating among countries who have been working together for 70 years. Or maybe less for the newcomers. So there is something here, some sort of socialization, some sort of mutual trust, of common beliefs, of common interests that allow a consensus to emerge. This is not enough. Then you need also some sort of policy entrepreneur or mediator. You need someone to take the initiative. And that's why I think that Macron is believing that he can do something. He will not be able to build a full policy or whatever, but at least to start a discussion and to create maybe a momentum around a certain number of concepts. And I think what the EU needs now is at least a method, an agreement on how we are going to proceed. Because if we continue just having a case-by-case approach of whatever happens in the world and organize a meeting of the European Council and start the discussion at 27, it cannot go. So don't underestimate the capacity of the EU to create a consensus, because there are things there that allows that. And also the question of the method, and we have very efficient methods for all sorts of policies. Now, maybe we should refine a bit our methods regarding foreign affairs. So there is one discussion which is going on now for 2 years of time in Brussels, and it's this one. For many decisions that are linked, let's say, to internal policies, decisions in the European Union are taken not at unanimity, but at some sort of qualified majority voting. So you need a certain number of member states representing a certain number of the population. And with a large majority, you can take a decision that is imposed to everyone. Then when it comes to international relations, foreign affairs, it's still unanimity. And some people consider now that to unlock the capacity of the EU to be active at global level, we should move to qualified majority voting for international relations, defense, and foreign affairs. Then I'm not sure that it's really a solution, because what would happen in that case is that the country who are put in minority would protest very soon, because they can accept, I don't know, a new norm on computers, a new definition of what gas is, or a new norm on banana or cell phone, whatever, even if it's not good for the economy. But then if the EU is preparing for war with I don't know which country and that member state is against, even if you have a rule of qualified majority voting, it's quite likely that that leader will come to the press and say, I was not okay, I don't agree, and then the EU cannot go forward. So not very easy, and it's a good question, Andri, how it's possible to do something in 6 months of time. But in the history, many things have happened in 6 months of time. on very difficult topics, and it's super difficult to make any sort of prediction. And each time people are writing books saying like, oh, it's going to be the failure of the EU because of the Brexit, because of the rejection of the constitutional treaty, because this or that, it never happened. It continues because maybe the EU is more solid than people think.
Okay, thank you, Andre and Olivier. And now we have a question from Vitor, from the same group. Hello, professors. I'd like to ask you about the receptivity of very divergent values from other countries outside of the European Union. How do you see, for example, the posture of the behavior of the European Union about the Brazilian government and the environmental issues?
This is a great question. The EU has been looking forever for some sort of identity strategy. And part of that identity strategy is linked to a certain number of values. I've mentioned some, that idea, the attachment of human rights, democracy, etc., is considered to be something very specific to the EU. My cat is making noise. And Clarissa, you were saying before the views people have in the southern part of the world about the behavior of various blocs. There is something still specific with the EU, is that story of conditionality, which has been there around for 20 years. The idea that the EU is only organizing trade and business and international agreement with countries that respect some democratic values and human rights or accept to do some progress. But this approach of conditionality, which is a bit threatening a country, saying, we will do something with you, but you make efforts regarding, I don't know, the role of women in your society, the next election, or you will stop jailing journalists, etc. This cannot work if Russia and China and the USA are not asking for everything, because the story has always been, especially in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, the European Union coming and to the leader and saying, we can propose you a very interesting project of cooperation and aid development around this and that, but you are going to make that and that efforts. And the guys say, yeah, forget it. I will negotiate with China. With China, they're going to buy my wood and give me 10% of the whole thing, and this is better. So to come back to the idea that there are some divergent views outside the EU. One thing which is still working at EU level is the attachment of environmental protection and fighting against global warming. Not all the members are totally in line on that, but at least I would say they have an approach which is more on the side of environmental protection than if you consider the positions of China or Russia or the USA of Donald Trump or even the USA of Joe Biden. And we see that very much in the relation with the Mercosur, because as you all know, there is a trade agreement that has been negotiated with the Mercosur since 1995 now, with negotiations that developed from 1999 to 2004, and again since 2016, and an agreement was reached in 2019. But since then, the situation is blocked. And it is mainly blocked for matters of environment protection, because some major country in the EU, Germany and France, and more recently Austria, they disagree with that free trade agreement on some things, because it's not only about environment, they're also concerned about competition on agricultural goods and health standards and also other things. But something which is very central is environmental standard and deforestation, which is namely mentioned by the leader. So here we have a sort of a clash between the values that are expressed by the current authorities of the country, of Brazil, and the views expressed by the leaders of the EU. And the agreement between Mercosur and the EU now is totally stuck because of that disagreement between the two blocs, which is grounded on some economic interest, etc., to be true, but which is very much also based on that question of environment and deforestation. You have seen, like me, the recent figures of the deforestation in Amazonia. It's not very good. and it is considered. So the point is, we are not going to ratify an agreement that was increase the situation of deforestation in Amazonia, because this is contradictory with the overall goal of European integration.
I will continue in the same topic of the agreement. Do you think this position, Olivier, is the same? Maybe it's common in the European Parliament and in some national parliaments. That the deputies, the members of parliament, they are in the same position, that they will not ratify this treaty until this differences in environment until we overcome it. And so maybe what would be needed for that? We would need different governments in Mercosur. And when do you think it could be possible?
The position, if you look a bit closely, the position in the different member states, in the different political parties, are quite different from one party to another, one country to another. For different countries, the positions are quite contradictory. What surprised me was the position of Angela Merkel, because you all know that the EU-Mercosur agreement has been called the agreement cow against cars. And who are making cars in Europe is Germans. So the challenge for the Germans are huge, because there is the idea of increasing the exportation of cars to Brazil, to Latin America, where they're already doing very good. And but even in Germany now, Angela Merkel, who's not from a Green Party, because she's from a conservative party, is concerned about deforestation, which means that the degree of sensitivity of the public opinion to the issue is high, which means that then there's some process of adjustment. So I mean that in most national parliaments, a lot of members have no idea about that agreement. But if they see that in the European Parliament, people are very concerned about that, if they see that then Merkel and then Macron are very much against the agreement, even if they are both, let's say, from the right wing and globally speaking, very favorable to free trade and business and all that, not really on the side of environmentalists that would like to stop all that. So even if those right-wing people are against the agreement, it's quite unlikely that on a sudden everybody will be in favor of that. So I'm not a specialist of the file, but I guess it will take a change in government, I would say, at least in Brazil, because this is really a polarizing element, and maybe some changes in the treaty. Here's a parallel could be made with the CETA, with what was the treaty between European Union and Canada, and the price to be able to ratify that agreement was to change a certain number of things in that text regarding solving conflict and regarding having extra guarantees on sanitary norms on beef or whatever, and things like that. And I think that changing a couple of things in the Mercosur EU treaty would help. The Commission is still very much pushing for ratification. If you go on the website of the Commission, talking about the number of employment that would be created and how good it will be for the economy and for growth, etc., etc. But even for them, it becomes a bit difficult, because Ursula von der Leyen, as president of the Commission, she had two mottos. The first one is the geopolitical commission. We have talked about this one. But the second motto and the second big project was a Green Deal, a new Green Deal for European Union, integrating green elements in all policies. She did that to get the support of the socialists and the Greens, but at some point you need to be coherent. And now we have a fundamental problem with that idea of organizing the global free trade, is that more and more people are concerned about, does it really make sense? So from a strictly economic point of view, it makes sense. Let's say we are going to eat in France Brazilian cows because, to do that and the meat is good. You are going to buy German cars because the German cars are nice. But does it really make sense in 2021 to have all the goods traveling 20,000 kilometers around the world before reaching the consumer? So some people start to be very concerned, saying we also have cows in Italy, in Germany, in France. Let's eat those. And maybe it's better for people in Latin America to build their own cars. We don't need to ship all those cars. And so that idea of local production, the impact of transport, is quite central in the reflection. And I would say also maybe there will be an impact of COVID about a reflection on economic specialization. Does it really make sense for Germany to only build cars and for Brazil only to do meat? Because when there is an international crisis, borders are closed. And then you discover that you are not able to have ventilators in hospitals because they're all made in China and no one knows how to do it. And we have the problem in Europe very much with the face mask because no one was able to produce that. It took 6 months to develop the industrial facilities to do face masks. So at some point, there is also a fundamental reflection on the model of development. Is it really nice to have over-specialization of the economy and those goods traveling all around the world to reach different countries? So there is also a fundamental crisis about that project of the Commission to organize a global free trade, because the Commission has been negotiating with Canada, with the USA. There was a TTIP, we had an agreement with Vietnam, there is one in negotiation with Australia, etc., etc. And some people, especially in the European Parliament, say it does not make sense at all.
Yes, yeah, you're totally right. And it's also very funny on one side. So I don't think we have any more questions. The students are thanking you in the chat. So thank you very much, Olivier. I don't know if you'd like to add some more remarks or add something else.
No, I've spoken far too much. I just wanted to conclude on a more positive note. We should not consider that the EU is no more interested in developing links with other blocs. This is not the story. And especially thinking about Latin America, I know that a lot of people were thinking about the relation with Russia, with China, with the US, are just thinking, let's make new friends. And as you know, there are some very strong links between Spain and Portugal and Italy and Latin America that are pushing very much in that direction. So I still believe that the EU has that vocation to develop links at international level, but maybe it should not be about only removing the borders and organizing the transportation of cars in one direction and cars in the other one. It can be about something else. It can be maybe more about culture. It can be about more about security, about fighting hunger and fighting the global warming. And more, this is the case. The international agreements that are negotiated by European Union are not only about trade, they're called mixed agreement because they include other things about education, about research, etc., which is a good thing, but which is then creating other issues because then sometimes the Commission is exceeding its competences. And for instance, with the CETA, that agreement with Canada, it was very problematic because it was also including things that was out of the competences of the EU. But I'm still confident that the EU will continue to promote multilateralism and develop relations with Latin America.
Yes, me too, hopefully. Thank you so much, Olivier, for your time, for speaking in English with us. I didn't say it before in the presentation that for me, on top of all of that, you were also my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, and I feel very fortunate to continue to learn from my supervisor until now, and now to be able to share all this knowledge and all these provocative remarks with my students. It's a privilege, and I feel really happy for that. So, merci beaucoup, un grand merci, un énorme merci, c'était un grand plaisir.
Merci Clarissa.
Et à très bientôt.
Thank you.